Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Hey, we're here. Another edition of In the First. Jim Weldon.
Chris Baronio.
And Brandon Brice.
We have our guest, Brandon Brice.
Ooh.
So,
All right.
right now it's Thursday.
March 6th.
Thank you, March 6th. So,
Losing track of time.
yeah, it is.
Year's going by quick.
President Trump gave a speech to the Congress and to the nation on Tuesday that was, and I'm not just saying this. This is a lot of political analysts that are saying it. It's probably one of the most remarkable addresses to Congress and the nation that has ever been seen. And that is not hyperbole. There's a lot of people saying that. I obviously felt that way. That speech really laid out an amazing explanation as to the progress that they have been able to achieve so far in this very short period of time. But he also laid out his vision for the future, and that was one of the specific aspects about it. Trump can talk a long time and fill a lot of information. I wouldn't say he's necessarily a very good speech deliverer. Everything was perfect in that speech, so much so that some of the polling that came out, I think CBS was at 76% approval and CNN was 69% approval. So the American people certainly liked it. What was even more stunning was the embarrassing, pitiful response from the Democrats, who were doing everything they could to obstruct. Congressman Green stood up with his cane up, shaking his cane at the president. He was asked to sit down, and then finally he was removed, and the sergeant of arms had to take him out. He's now filing impeachment. Well, he does that every time anyway. But the Democrats, and then they had these stupid cards. Their response was just idiotic, and that was even more of what made this so successful was how pitiful the Democrat response was and how embarrassing it was. So that's kind of like the big news. There's been a lot of information has come out of that, and anything other big.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you hope that there's moments in those kind of speeches, regardless of who's in power, where we as Americans can kind of rally around it and find some common ground, right? And you had like a kid with cancer getting a cool, Secret Service?
Yeah.
Badge, right? You got a kid getting into West Point.
Yep.
And even me, as a guy who went to Annapolis, can say, like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Damn proud of the kid that he's signing up to give at least, like, the next 9 years of his life in the service of the nation. Various other points like that. And it's like, dang, how come we can't even rally around those?
Yeah. Democrats wouldn't do it. But wouldn't stand, wouldn't applaud.
Right. And I'm like, man, this is how we got to figure out how to get past that.
Yeah, we do.
Because those are the things where you'd think it's a no-brainer for us to be on the same page.
The recognition of one of the young ladies that was murdered at the hands of an illegal immigrant. Our congressman Tim McBride was on his phone. So disgusting. So anyway, that's kind of like the big thing.
Yep.
So we have Brandon with us, and it's a real pleasure.
Brandon Brice.
Yep, I'm going to go over his some of his resume, and we'll attach that. He actually has a website, man.
Dang impressive. I do want to say thanks for making the
Thank
time
you.
for
Thank
us.
you
This
for
is so
having
cool
me.
to get you in here. I know
Thank you
your
for having
schedule is crazy, so I'm glad we were able to find time.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were a staffer for former House Speaker Dennis Hastert, associate with the National Urban League's Economic Opportunity Institute, Director of Education and African American Affairs in the Office of the New Jersey Governor Christie. That's at the same time I was working at the New Jersey Office of Emergency Management.
That's right.
Veterans Empowerment Organization of Georgia, executive role with the Boy Scouts of America's Career Exploring Programs, Director of Philanthropy for the United Way of Delaware, Vice President of Community Relations and College Advancement for Cecil College, which is where you're at right now.
Yeah.
Ethics Commissioner for Newcastle County, appointed by Newcastle County Executive at that time, Matt Myers, now the governor. And you were also part of the state magistrate screening process appointed by Governor John Carney. You have a bachelor's in business administration from Howard University and a master's of science from Rutgers University. And you served as a fellow for the United Nations Foundation and Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. You live in Wilmington, and you currently are serving as the treasurer or secretary for the Delaware GOP.
That's right. It's shocking how I was able to, do that in a short amount of time. But,
Yeah.
it's interesting. You talked about the State of the Union, and I watched it, and I couldn't help to think that whether you like the president or not, that's not important. But what is important is the fact that you have economic growth in 2 months. You have a kid who literally almost died
Mm-hmm.
and not only survived cancer, but was given the opportunity to now achieve his dream of one day becoming a police officer, and was deputized as a secretary. I can't even become a Secret Service, and this,
Right.
this kid becomes a Secret Service, and that was a time where the country was supposed to put our politics aside and say we're finally on the right track. And what do you have? You have, and let me be very clear for you folks out there, because I have friends who are Democrats. I have family members who are Democrats. But these are not just Democrats. These are party machine politicians. And let me tell you the difference in what a public servant is versus a politician. What you saw last night was not, those were not public servants, because the whole purpose of Washington is that it's supposed to be, when the president succeeds, we succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter who the president is. And the reality is, and I think that's why you don't hear people talking about it, because it's quiet. Prior to January, the last 4 years, the country wasn't succeeding.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly not.
I mean, and it's clear as day. And it's interesting because, tonight, I know you had asked me, what we're going to talk about. And I want to talk about, when we talk about Delaware, the first state, we have to talk about this education crisis. We are in a crisis. And not only are we in a crisis, but anytime you have the leader of the free world who lives 15 minutes away from here, literally, and you're 46 in the nation, 60%, I almost wore a pin today, but I decided to dress warm, but I almost wore a pin today that had 60. And for you folks out there, 60 represents the percentage of Delaware young people, black, white, Hispanic, doesn't matter, who can't read. These are real statistics. And then you have this senator who literally walked into the U.S. Senate seat. I'll get on that later, who was a congressperson. And these folks advocate for failing schools. And yet, they don't send their kids to the schools, which, when you think about it, is interesting, because now you're saying, well, wait a minute, there's a dichotomy in this education crisis. And what we're saying is that if you are rich enough or connected enough, then your kids have a shot at success.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are low income, if you don't have the means, if you are poor or under the poverty line, you're screwed. That's the education system in Delaware.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I mean, it's plain as day. We started last year an organization of like-minded people from education, from business, from civic organizations called Fix the Damn Schools. And literally, it was birthed because I was at an event, and somebody said, we need to fix the damn schools. And I said, damn, that's really catchy. Really catchy. And we ran with it. And it's interesting because we've had people come out, support it, but the education system alone should be the reason that folks in Delaware should take another look at who's running Dover. We have a governor, and let me say this. The current governor, he's been an ally, so I can't speak ill will. But the whole purpose of leadership is to be held accountable. And it's interesting because I think, we haven't seen it yet. It's first 100 days, so I'll give him a pass. But the challenge is you haven't had a Republican governor in 20-plus years.
Mike
Right.
Castle.
Mike Castle. You haven't had a Republican majority in the legislature in, 30 years, roughly?
It was 2008, I think, was the last. That's when we lost both the House and the Senate, I believe.
That was both sides. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the issue is, when you look at the numbers, 46 in the nation, we're next to Mississippi. 60% of the kids can't read. You've got jobs and industry that's leaving because they're saying, you don't have the workforce. Who's to blame? Well, who's been in power? It's very simple. And so I say that, this issue is a crisis because you creating a permanent underclass. Let me be very clear on what I mean by underclass versus middle class. Let me also say this. I support labor. I think labor is a good thing because the reality is every kid can't go to college, nor should they. There are jobs that need to be filled. Plumbers, if my toilet breaks, who's going to fix it? And by the way, have you seen the price of the cost of a plumber nowadays?
Yeah.
$200 and $300 just to come out.
Plumbers, electricians,
roofers,
framers, you name it.
Your car, there's a shortage of auto techs. So what we're seeing, and I think this is, whether you like Trump or not, let's look at the facts. Why are we sending everybody to college? When the reality is most folks, half of them get in, half of them finish, but all of them have debt. And this debt issue, when you now talk about, who's in the better slot? The person that said, I want to do something. I want to pick up a trade. I want to pick up a skill. And, whether it's HVAC, whether it's plumbing, whether it's being a Boilermaker, a pipe fitter, these are the real issues. This is how you bring back Delaware's middle class. But I'll go a step further. I had a conversation a while back with a union leader. I'm not going to put him out there. And he said, Brandon, we want to increase diversity, but folks just can't do the math. If you want to be an electrician, you got to be able to do simple math. If you want to be a welder, you got to know how to count. And so the challenge is, even when we have the conversation of attracting new talent to Delaware, you still have to know basic math. Go to Christiana School District. Have you seen the math scores? They're abysmal. And you can get it because you pay taxes to it. So the challenge is whether you're Democrat, Republican, atheist, socialist, communist, whatever you are, there's an education crisis in our state, and neither senator has dealt with it. They talk about it, they tap dance, but they haven't really dealt with the issue. Tim, Sarah, whatever you want to call him, hasn't talked on the issue. The governor, we'll see, it's first 100 days. And so what you have is, and these aren't bad people. They just don't want to address the issue and the elephant in the room. And again, whether you like or support the president, he's addressing the issues in the room.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's clear as day.
So there's a lot to you through down there. So I want to go back to when you were talking about the Democrats and their response. So there are some who think,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to refer to Pete Hegseth's book as part of this. There are some who think that the current Democratic Party is really being controlled by Marxists. You mentioned Sal Lewinsky and the rules for radicals.
Mm-hmm.
If you take a look at Lenin when he was trying to do the revolution in the
Mm-hmm.
The Soviet Union was in war.
Mm-hmm.
The worse the country went, the better opportunity it was for his revolution to occur. So he was hoping that Russia would do worse, do bad in the war. And so, to some extent, because they are so anti anything, I think that there's a lot of the very strong Marxist aspect of part of that. And Saul Lewinsky was a communist. He was a Marxist. He wrote that Rules for Radicals. The second point that I wanted to make, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on it, is Pete Hegseth, our current Secretary of Defense, wrote a fantastic book, and I suggest you get it, Battle for the American Mind. And he really goes through the history of education. And he doesn't call it public education anymore. He calls it government education. And the reason why he calls it government education is for a lot of reasons. Part of this, which goes into that Marxist socialist ideology, and Thomas Dewey, a progressive, had a major impact on this, is that the education is not being taught to teach people to be independent thinkers. The education is being taught to be part of a cog, in a sense, to be part of the machine, to be part of the state, which is what Marxists and what socialists want, is that they want that adherence to the state. Very, very fascinating. And of course, when you get into the DEI is Marxist ideology. Everything is always there to divide. That's what Marxists want to do. They want to create division, and then they want to divide. So, thoughts on that? There's a lot there.
Well, first of all, the most important thing that a person can do is read. And I think the challenge is that education, government education, public education, they're teaching people what to think, not how to think.
Correct.
They're teaching people what to read in the book, not read the entire book. And so the challenge that you have is you've got a system that has already picked winners and losers. That's the beauty of capitalism. Let me be very clear, capitalism is not perfect. But what capitalism does, I was a Boy Scout years ago, and the most powerful thing of that organization is that it taught you this thing called merit, which is basically saying you work hard, you benefit. You don't, you won't. That's not the mindset of today's leftist agenda. Today's leftist agenda says you work hard, you might get rewarded. You don't, you still might get rewarded.
Yeah. So I don't think capitalism chooses winners and losers. I think Marxism and socialism does, because capitalism, for what you said, if you work hard, you can actually succeed. You can overcome tremendous handicaps and odds to become very successful, and many of our very successful people have done that. But when you have a mandate, when you have government that is controlling what you know, how you know it, all right, that's really picking the winners and the losers. And there's very few winners and a lot of losers.
There was a debate recently, and I wasn't going to bring this up, but you brought it out of me.
Hey, man.
You brought it out of me.
You never know where we're going to go.
That's right. There was a debate in Wilmington about the Caesar Rodney statue. Now, this is a sensitive topic.
Right.
And I recognize that. Caesar Rodney Institute wanted to have a conversation on who Caesar Rodney was, why the statue was removed, which had no public influence. It was all politicians that made that decision. The community had no say. And because of pressures, the conversation didn't happen. And let me say this, I think there is power in conversation. There's power in understanding that, we have not always done great things in history. But it's important that so you don't repeat certain things in history.
Absolutely.
One thing about Caesar Rodney, and let me say this, I'm not saying Caesar Rodney was perfect by any means. But the one thing that as an outsider to Delaware, or from Delaware, I'm from Michigan originally, um, I had always heard of the name, but I never knew who the man was. And there's a couple things that's interesting about Caesar Rodney. The first thing is Caesar Rodney didn't live long. He lived, as a matter of fact, I don't even think he made it to 50. Caesar Rodney dealt with a ailment. He had cancer in his, I think he had facial cancer.
Yep, he did.
Caesar Rodney was one of the few people that the two, I can't remember who the two leaders were at the time, but they went to Philadelphia and decided that Delaware may not have been worthy of becoming a state, which means he had to get up and say and drive. And keep in mind, this is before I-95. This is before any form of structure that you had today. This guy got on a horse and rode from Dover all the way to Philadelphia to make sure Delaware became a state. But the most important thing, and this is for a person, a minority like myself, that he does not get credit for, and this is the first documented text of any conversation of such, Caesar Rodney was the first person, white man, on record saying that the slave trade needed to come to an end.
Wow.
Now, why is that important? Well, that's important because at that day, that was blasphemy for a person to step against the grain, the norm, and say, this is wrong, and we need to do something about it. And it got voted down in the Dover House. So there's two ways to look at that. And you can say, okay, well, he had a plantation. And that's, again, he wasn't perfect. But I think the conversation is important for people to hear it because Caesar Rodney, and you can ask any historian worth their coof, despite his flaws, was the catalyst that really began the abolitionist movement in America. And that's powerful, very powerful. And coming from Delaware, being the first state of a man that went against the grain, could have been shunned for that decision, but was brave enough to at least put it to action in the assembly. So I think these are the types of conversations, getting back to this education piece, is that these are the type of conversations that we need to have and that the community needs to have. Forget the politicians. They've got their own agenda and playbook. The community needs to know that according to the legislature, which is pretty much democratically run, again, I'm not saying anything that's not factual, they have said that your child is not important because they have not supported quality education. They have not supported charter schools in high-need areas. There's a war on the poor, and ironically, it's not coming from the right. It's coming from the left.
So using Caesar Rodney is a great example of what you were talking about in terms of like how to think versus what to think, right? You would sort of hope that the schools would be leading the discussion to say, hey, do you know about Caesar Rodney? Tell me what you know about him. Where was he? What did he do? What were some of the things he contributed? What were some of the scars and marks on his record, right? And get people to like think about it and go do some research and form opinions on their own. But it seems like we just take if I hear you right, we take the easy road, which is you need to know that Caesar Rodney was a slave owner and was bad.
It's not the
Period.
easy road; it's the propaganda road.
It is.
Well, yeah, sorry, but the easy road from
you
the way that schools are teaching.
the way that there's this whole notion right now of love and hate, right? I'm a big fan of melting pots, right? Because melting pots, whether you live in Philly, whether you live in New York, Chicago, Miami, they force you to deal with people. They force you to interact. They force you to have conversations, tough conversations. And I think education needs to be the same way, where, we have some of the greatest schools here in Delaware, St. Andrews, Tower Hill, great schools. But then we have schools where kids have to worry about bullying. They've got to worry about gangs. These are real issues in our schools.
Mm-hmm.
They've got to worry about, not being able to go to swim practice in the morning because they're in fear of, what can happen to them on their way to schools. So we got some real serious issues and challenges when we talk about education. And it's interesting. I was having a conversation going back to the skilled trade conversation. And somebody said, well, we've presented skilled trade and opportunities for young people to get a trade or get a skill, but they're just people, minority groups, we're just not seeing the numbers. Well, let me tell you why. The trades, and I don't know if most folks ever thought of it from this perspective, the trades is a hand-me-down career. And people say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I'll give you a perfect example. Those folks who grew up with a father in their household, where it was working on the car in the summertime or helping with the garbage disposal and fixing it. What you folks don't realize is those folks, as a child, knew what a wrench was, knew what different appliances were. So even if they don't go into that career, they're already familiar with those trade tools. And I think one of the challenges is that when you are introduced to that at a later time in life, of course there's no interest because no one has ever exposed it to you. When you look at the math scores, math is everything. And the challenge is it's not so much that young folks in the inner city can't do the math, but it's a language issue. Math is not, when someone says using quotient or dividend or sum, they understand the what it is. They don't understand the language. And I think one of the challenges is that we need to encourage more men of color, specifically men of color, to go into higher education, to go into secondary education, because I think what people are saying is that if they can't get it at home, they can get it in the classroom. But this crisis is unique because Delaware, Wilmington, is at a point of crisis. Businesses are leaving the state. These are facts. They're not coming to Delaware. The tax incentive that brought many people here 40 years ago, 50 years ago under former Governor DuPont. People are starting to look in other ways, in other places. Delaware always had a unique presence because of its proximity to the power, which is Washington, D.C., and the money, which is New York City. So we're in a unique place as Delawareans. I've been a Delawarean for 6 years, counting. And I think the challenge is education has to be the issue of our day. It has to be the conservative battle cry because it's the one issue where those folks on the other side have to say we failed.
So I wanted to talk about a couple things about that. So we already know, we laid out all the facts are there. That our education system is one of the worst in the in the nation. We also, per capita, are one of the spending the most money on it. We also know that statistically, when you take a look at all the you mentioned a few schools. Red Clay School District has problems. There's the 17 single-digit schools, which are the 17 schools, 15 of them in Newcastle County, where the student body is less than 10% can either read or write at their appropriate grade level. Horrible. Mostly it's the math and not necessarily the English language arts, and the math is very critical. We also know statistically that most of the poorer functioning schools are the inner city schools. Representative McBride, when he was a senator, had the first Senate district, which encompasses most of the city of Wilmington. You said he never discussed any of these things. The Democrats in Wilmington, vast majority, continue to vote for the same thing over and over and over again. How do we turn this around? How do we fix the schools? You mentioned that you were in the organization Fix the Damn Schools, and of course we know our beloved Ron Russo, right?
Absolutely.
Who was my vice principal, because I went to St. Mark's High School, which we were going to put him on a podcast, but then he ended up dying on us. And I say that jokingly because if you read his obituary, he wrote it. And when you read the obituary, you said, I bet you're as shocked as I am.
Yeah, sense of humor to the end.
Oh, he did.
A loss for Delaware. He had some great plans. He had a huge
loss
impact.
for Delaware.
Yeah.
So how do we fix it?
Wow. How much time you got?
Yeah.
So first of all, let me say rest in peace to Ron Russo. Ron was actually a big part of Fix the Damn Schools.
Right.
And Ron would always say, and let me make sure I'm quoting this right, because Ron is probably looking at me from the heavens. Education is a business.
He did always say that.
The parent is the customer, and the child is the product. And I didn't know what he meant by that until I start evaluating, wait a minute. Education is a business. The parent is the customer. The child, depending on what they're learning, is the product. So the first thing is you've got to have a message that resonates with parents. And there's no other thing that riles a parent up knowing that their child is being duped by a failing education system. And worse, to have a politician, Congress, Senate, governors, mayors, tell you that, oh, the education system is getting better. Oh, the education system is getting great. And yet, they're advocating for failing schools, but refuse to send their kid to that same failing school.
Yeah.
All right. Do as I say, not as I do.
There used to be a saying, because I'm from Michigan, but my family's all from Savannah, and there used to be a Southern saying that don't piss on me and call it rain.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, one of the principles that Ron Russo, and as part of the schools of business, his position, which is the bold plan, which we actually know quite well because when we developed the Delaware GOP education plan, we based a lot of it on his bold plan. His position is that each school, being a business, should be run like a business, and they should tailor the needs based upon their clientele.
Their customer base.
Correct.
Yep.
Not one massive system that everyone's going to learn.
Yep.
Because each student is different and each parent has different needs. And that was a very, very bold concept. The timeliness of this is that, in Delaware we have 19 school districts, right? So his position was he didn't say you didn't need school districts, but the reality was he didn't think we needed school districts. When we would talk about school boards, he said, don't worry about the school boards. Focus on the principal and focus on the school itself. The reason why this is very timely is that since President Carter implemented the Department of Education, our education system has declined. I don't know whether there's a correlation, but you can certainly say, wow, that's really an interesting aspect. President Trump is now considering issuing an executive order to disband the Department of Education, which Democrats are saying, oh my gosh, this is horrible. It's going to kill our schools.
Guess what? They're already dead.
Already dead. Right.
Yeah, but the principle that Ron Russo said, that if we focus everything on the school itself, why would you need a Department of Education? And what are your thoughts about that aspect?
I am all about local control.
Right.
The reality is, and let's just look at Delaware. Let's look at Wilmington. Why is a guy, legislator in Dover, from Sussex County, telling folks in Wilmington what they need in their school districts?
Right.
Pretty
Agreed.
simple.
Agreed.
And vice versa.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
Why is a guy in Wilmington telling Sussex County what they need in their so I think the country is correct around decentralizing education, local control. But the other thing, and I'm a big fan of mayoral control, and I'll tell you why. When you have mayoral control, right now you have X amount of legislators who are making decisions on education. And when it gets screwed up, they're pointing fingers. Oh, it's your fault. It's my fault. It's fault. It's fault. But when you have mayoral control, when the education gets messed up, there's one person to blame. And it's accountability. And what it does, and I think this is the theme that we're seeing, again, whether you like Trump or not, that's your piece. But what this administration is bringing back to Washington, I don't know if it's been in Washington in a minute, is it's bringing back accountability. It's holding somebody accountable. Somebody said to me, Doge is just awful. And I said, well, is it awful that people want to be better stewards with your money? Well, no. Is it awful that you should know where every dime of your taxpayer dollars, where it's going? Well, no. So what's so awful about it? Well, it's because of the messenger. That's why people have an issue with it. Because I guarantee you, if Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, if they had come up with Doge, they talked about it, but they never did anything about it. If they had actually did something, oh, this is great, we're accountable, we're doing, but they didn't do it. Some are scared of the Department of Education. And my question is, let's look at Philadelphia. Let's look at Chicago, where there are literally gangs in the schools. Rahm Emanuel did something very unwise, and clearly he didn't have any consultants at that time.
The mayor of Chicago.
The former mayor of Chicago.
Yeah, right.
He said, we want to cut costs and we're going to reduce school districts, and a very conservative approach. But what he didn't realize is that in Chicago, which is very segregated, there were gangs in each school, different gangs. And when you combined it, you created World War III. So the reality is we need a gut check on the status of public education. And we need to question the quality of education. We need to question, why are some young people being encouraged to go to college? College is a beautiful thing. I went to college, got degrees. But I have family members who did not go to college, who are doing just as well, if not better than me, without the debt. And so one thing I like about what I'm seeing now is I think we're getting back into the American spirit of innovation. We're getting back into the American spirit of meritocracy and being rewarded for your hard work and not just because you showed up. I think we're getting back to this focus that people have the right to disagree and be okay. You know, censorship to me, when I heard it, and I have to give our young people credit because when the censorship conversation came up, all of a sudden young people started becoming, oh, this is wrong. We need to do something about it. But censorship, to me, is un-American. And this is going to be very controversial, what I say. People, now let me say this very clear for your listeners. The beautiful thing about America is that people have the right to be stupid. Let me say that again. People have the right to be stupid. When you take that right away, that's not America. And the beautiful thing about freedom, real freedom, is that you don't get to determine what somebody's freedom is. And unfortunately, that's what our friends on the left don't understand, is they want to dictate what your freedom is. That's not freedom.
So you've mentioned several times, and I agree with your position on that, that we should do more to facilitate allowing our school children to get into the trades. And now we had Senator Hansen on for episode 4. Well, I think when most of our focus was on
Energy.
energy, and she's a Democratic senator. And we're in her Senate district right now. But I've known her for a long time. I know in some of the discussions I've had, and this is a Democrat, who did say that she felt that there are not enough opportunities for VOTEC. As a matter of fact, we have so many seats that people want for VOTEC, and there's no way we can actually fill it. There's just not enough. So how do we get around that? Because they're building a brand new VOTEC school across the street, Hodgson VOTEC. A lot of money, years in the planning. If we're going to try to build another VOTEC school, we're talking about 4, 5, 6 years out. How do we fill that gap? How do we help that out? Because I agree with you. Having opportunity for learning a trade is tremendous. How can we achieve that?
You know, one of the challenges, and I've heard this, is, you know, there's not enough people who, number one, are going into the trades, are interested in the trades. But then the issue and the challenge is that when you get your journeyman's license, or whatever they call it, someone's got to hire you. And the trades are, you know, the little itty bitty secret about the trades is that if my dad was in it, uncle, cousin, these are jobs that I keep over, you know, I keep close to the chest, because who knows, you know, it could be, you know, one of those situations where you may need a job. There's power in employment. And so, you know, and again, it goes back to what is the conversation? You know, again, high schools that we create, you know, for those failing schools, you want to fix failing schools in Delaware, turn them into trade schools. Turn them into trade schools. I'm not a fan of closing schools. Let me take that back. I'm not a fan of closing good quality schools. I am a fan of, you know, if we're going to turn down, or if we're going to close a school, then maybe we want to reconsider and close and turn it into a trade school or turn it into a VOTEC. But then we have to be very concentrated on how do we get the laborers back involved in education. And you don't need 1 million education licenses to tell if you can teach. You know, I think we also need to realize where are the jobs going? Because a lot of times, you know, we're looking at the jobs that are here today, but we're not focusing on the jobs of the future. I can give you one word This word automation is going to completely revolutionize this country. And let me tell you what I mean by that. 20 years ago, there was a person who, and today, who drove a truck from New York to California, transporting goods and services. Well, now there's conversations, GM just had it, where now they're talking about autonomous vehicles. And what's the liability of that? So the only reason there are not trucks driving themselves is because of the lawyers and the liability. The companies are ready to do it because it saves healthcare costs. It saves so many other factors. And it's interesting because now the automation, I mean, you got McDonald's where we know when we were growing up, you went in, you had 4 or 5 people behind the counter taking orders, cooking burgers.
Right.
Now you have self-autonomous McDonald's. So the question is, how do you prepare an entire generation for that? Getting back to your question now, when you talk about vocational, I think the challenge they're having is right now, labor's in a very bad spot because labor and technology, I think they can coexist. But the problem is business says we want it faster, better, cheaper, more affordable. Labor is saying we want to support the working man. But what happens when the working man doesn't have the skill sets or has to change his entire toolkit at 40 and 50 and 60 years old? So, and I think even Elon Musk is kind of realizing that, you got to start as early as middle school when you're talking about tech jobs. And what does that mean? Well, last time you've been to a factory. Factories are not, listen, I'm from Michigan. We're the home of, factories. And when I was a kid, I remember the dirty, grungy factories near the water. And these guys were hard workers, providing for their families. Factories today, you could eat off the floor because they're that clean and they're more tech driven now. And so I almost think that the vocational model that you're seeing today is outdated because it's focusing on the jobs that are here today, but I don't see enough emphasis on the jobs of the future. And I think Trump and Elon Musk, I think they're at least looking at what is the economy going to look like we're in 2025, 2040, 2060.
Right.
And you were touching on what businesses wants, right? Better, faster, cheaper. What labor wants, right? Help the working man. But what I think is interesting is all of the people who are trained all come through the educational system. And what do the educators, let me say that right. What do the educators want?
Power.
And yeah,
They want
you
power.
said it.
They want power.
And it's
They want
like
power.
they're not right now, in my opinion, looking at ways to get through better, faster, cheaper. Like you talked about Votech, right? We're building a new one and it would take 6 years to build another.
Right.
But like, what if we applied kind of the business methodology and said,
That's exactly where I was going to go on that. Go ahead.
right,
Take it away.
yeah. And you go, wow, I have, whatever, I don't know how many kids are down there, 500 students, right? And we currently have them here 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. I don't know how many weeks are in school, 30 weeks or something like that. But what if you could reimagine that curriculum and say, is there a way I could do 4 hours a day?
Yeah.
And then I'll have an afternoon set and I'll get twice as many kids through the same building.
And just to carry that a little further. So I'm a businessman and I have a store. And I have people coming in and they're asking for a particular product, but I don't seem to be able to get that product. But I know people want that product. Well, what do? I go out and try to find someone who can supply me that product. I'm a businessman. My customers are saying, I want this. All right, well, I got to find a better. So you find that. Well, if I'm the manager of a school and my customers are saying, my kids would really love to learn how to be an auto mechanic, but the state massive system isn't offering that. Since I'm a businessman, why wouldn't I go out and try to find a local source to provide some of that? See, that's the beauty of when you decentralize and when each school takes care of the issues, the problems that their customers, the parents,
Mm-hmm.
are asking for, is that they figure out solutions to do that. And that becomes a very critical component because we could marry up with businesses. Tim Bolden, who I've known for years, Bolden Brothers, I don't know if he's still doing it, but for a while, they were going to pay somebody $80,000 a year to teach them the trade, not even qualified, just to teach them the trade because they couldn't find people to do it. So we have to refocus how we're looking at this and not thinking that it's all from the high. And by the way, the reason why McDonald's is going to kiosks and automation is because of the government.
Yeah.
And the reason why they're doing it is because it was cheaper to have the kids do it. They would continue to have the kids do it because it worked for years. McDonald's has been a very successful corporation. And it was a rite of passage. When you're a kid and 16 years old and you get your driver's license, you get a job at McDonald's. Well, until the government came along and said, well, you can't raise a family on that. It wasn't intended to raise a family on that. It was intended to give kids an opportunity in their first experience working. And it worked well for McDonald's and it worked well for the kids until the government got involved. And the government now demanded that you have to, so the increasing cost of labor made it too expensive. And so they go to automation. And that's the reason why you're going to go to automation. It's because the labor is too expensive or the labor can't do the work.
There is a. It's funny you mentioned that. There is, I was monitoring the EV conversation, and it was interesting because at the time I was working in education, higher education, and they said, the government, the state government, state of Maryland, your good favorite place, Annapolis. They said, well, we need to create content for these EV vehicles. And we said, okay, well, let's see what the demand is. General Motors wasn't budging.
No.
Ford wasn't budging. Chrysler wasn't budging. So then we said, well, let's see if we have a demand to create the curriculum. And it was interesting because we said, well, we can create the curriculum. But the problem is we have nowhere to send the young people because no one's hiring in this industry. So why are we pushing it? So it's a great example when you're talking about what happens when the government gets in the way. And it's funny because now, even some of your biggest champions for EV vehicles are saying, well, that probably wasn't such a great idea at all. Again, it's the why. And it goes back to, education. And if you really wanted to fix society, I can tell you what you do. Number one, we don't value the importance, in my opinion, enough of why fatherhood matters. Fatherhood is not just about marital relations, but fatherhood is an economic issue. Fatherhood is an employment issue. Fatherhood is an educational issue. I can tell you right now, I was horrified to bring, bad grades in when I was a kid not because of the teacher, not because of the class, because I was scared what my dad would say when he looked at that report card. I see so many young people, specifically young ladies, in these urban centers that are struggling. But they're struggling because as the urban cities are becoming more expensive, as food is becoming more expensive, as heat and energy is becoming more expensive, it would be nice to have another income in the house. And so I think as a country, we've got to get back to why fatherhood really matters. I'm going to throw a plug out. There's an organization I'm a part of called Every Man Counts. And it's an important organization because it's saying that fatherhood is a way, not the way, but a way to help empower families, to help empower children. And I think that we have not done a good job with making family, bringing it back to being the center of the emphasis in this place we call the United States of America.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I agree.
Couple minutes, final comments.
Education is one of those things that if we don't get this right, we will be the first state, but we will be in last place. Matter of fact, that even sounds like a good book title. Maybe I need that. But it's important because let's be clear on education and why, for your listeners, why it matters. Education, without an education, breeds poverty. Poverty doesn't care about what race you are, doesn't care about where you come from, doesn't care if you're male or female. And so when we educate young people, we inspire a generation, we encourage the next generation of leadership, and most important, we save our state and we save our city, if we're talking about Wilmington, from becoming another Camden, New Jersey, another Flint, Michigan, another Gary, Indiana. And so we have to be protective. If we don't protect anything else in this state, in this nation, we have got to protect the quality of education.
Yeah, that's absolute.
So true.
Yeah. Well, Brandon,
This was awesome.
yeah, we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Very much. So it's a real pleasure to have you, a national figure. So
Look at that.
Not at all. Not at all.
all right. Well, thank you, everybody. As you view this, we would like you to share it with other people to get the message out. If you like what you're seeing, hit the like button and then subscribe. And that way, whenever we put out new ones, you'll get a little, when you go to YouTube, you'll see a little red dot and you'll know there's new content. So, Brandon Brice.
Fantastic.
and
Thanks
the
for
first,
sharing
thank
time
you
with
very
us.
much.
The Brice is right.
The Brice is right. Yeah, yeah.
Love it.
That was your show, wasn't it?
That was my show.
Yeah, it was.
Yep.
Yeah,
Brice is
that was
right.
pretty good. So, all right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.